Hello, young scholars, defenders of democracy, champions of the republic. I'm going to keep trying these introductions until I get it right one of these times. This is Mr. Barderone with your Flip Classroom on civil liberties. And in this video, we're going to take a look at religious freedom. Really interesting case law here, blending religion and government. It's always a fun mix. So both Jefferson and James Madison in the 1800s wrote for and called for a wall of separation. And in 1802, in a letter, Thomas Jefferson actually uses the phrase a separation of church and state. As we know, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It's not in the First Amendment. That phrase, separation of church and state, will actually be worked into the Supreme Court into a later ruling. But because James Madison and Jefferson and Washington and John Adams, they were keenly aware, and other founding fathers too, they were aware of absolute monarchs in England and France who had created and established a national religion. This is why the First Amendment puts that up front. And they have what's called the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which says the government cannot create a religion. They also have the Free Exercise Clause, which prevents governments from stopping religious practices. So these are particularly important, and it's a very neat topic of conversation. A lot of the founding fathers really don't mention Jesus Christ per se in any of their writings. They do mention divine providence in some instances, but it's always a fun topic because lots of people think that either Washington and Jefferson and Madison, all these guys were either atheistic or more than likely they were agnostic, meaning they believed in something, but not necessarily in the form of a Judeo-Christian form. But nevertheless, they believed in a strict separation of church and state. So the first case we're going to take a look at is Reynolds v. the United States in 1879. So this is not one of the 15 required Supreme Court cases, but you may need to work it into an FRQ, so we'll do a little bit of background on it. So in this instance, the court ruled that the federal government could limit religious practices, and in particular, polygamy. So in the late 1800s, Ulysses S. Grant signs a law that is an attempt to end polygamy in the territory of Utah. And he sends U.S. Marshals out to round up hundreds of Mormons out in this territory, and one of them being George Reynolds. George Reynolds files an appeal and argues that under the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution, under the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution, he is entitled to polygamy. The Supreme Court disagrees. And the Mormons lost. And the federal government, for the first time, kind of weighs into this issue of religious freedom and says that the government can, in fact, limit religious practices. So we're beginning to see a blending of these freedoms. In 1947, in a case called Everson v. Board of Education, this, fun fact, is a New Jersey case. I was giving a shout out to New Jersey. So New Jersey allowed public school boards to reimburse parents for transporting their kids to school, even if they attended parochial schools or religious schools. So the question is, can public funds be used to transport kids to religious schools? So the question that arises, or some facts that you should know, is that the state law, the Supreme Court said, was not meant to promote or handicap any religion. The law gave no money to parochial schools, but rather a voucher to parents to take the kids to an accredited schools. Preventing payments to parochial schools would handicap the students' ability to get to school, much like fire stations, police, and utilities, and other school transportation, and other non-religious services. So nothing really changes in Everson in terms of religious freedom, but the court did signal that the religious clauses of the First Amendment apply to the states via the 14th Amendment. And in their opinion, they use the Jefferson quote about separation of church and state. So if, we're using this to study from, if you need to reference this case at some point, Everson's big notoriety is the fact that this is when the religious freedom is now incorporated. So, religious freedom, 1962, Engel v. Vital. This is a big case. It's a required Supreme Court case that you need to know for College Board. We're going to spend some time, obviously, reading the opinions and going over things in class. So this takes place in the 1960s, and the ACLU argues that a 22-word non-denominational prayer was unconstitutional. So think about that. If you opened every school day with a prayer, does it violate the First Amendment? And this was the issue. Does the reading of a non-denominational prayer at the start of a school day violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? And the decision was yes, that in fact the First Amendments of children who did not want to pray were violated, where their Establishment Clause was violated. The court agreed in 1962, and a year later, they outlawed Bible readings in school districts in Pennsylvania. In both cases, school projected or promoted religion, and in this case, it was struck down. Interestingly enough, in another case, a year later in a Wisconsin case, the Wisconsin high school violated an Amish parent's rights to teach their own children. The Amish said that that state was violating their freedom of religion. And the court found, in fact, that the Amish's alternative mode of informal vocational training paralleled the school's objectives, and forcing these children to attend the school violated the basic tenets of Amish freedom because it forced the children into unwanted environments. So we're beginning to see, beginning in the 1960s, and automatically you should be thinking 1962, who's on the bench? It's the Warren Court, so it's going to be a little bit more active in promoting and protecting civil liberties. Next case we're going to take a look at, this is Lemon v. Krutzman, 1971. So the year should tell you something. It's now 9 years after the Engel v. Vital case. This is the Burger Court, so it's not as liberal, but it is an activist court. So interesting fact is that money provided financial support for secular objects in a non-public school. So just a little bit of background. In Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, those states passed laws to pay teachers of secular subjects in religious schools with state funds. So in essence, private schools were being funded with public school money. The state mandated such subjects as English and math, and reasoned that it should assist parochial schools in carrying out state requirements. You know, why not? There's nothing wrong with that. In trying to determine the constitutionality of the statute, the court decided that the laws created an excessive entanglement, and there's a really good quote from the brief: an excessive entanglement between church and state. The court said that the teachers in these parochial schools may improperly involve the faith of their teaching, even if the state monitored them. Such a relationship would cause an entanglement. So, did the states violate the Establishment Clause by making state financial aid available to church-related educational institutions? Well, again, the Warren Burger Court unanimously said yes. The states violated the Establishment Clause and articulated that Jefferson's wall of separation is far from being a wall in this policy, and that the states, in this case Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, blurred, and I'm quoting from the opinion now, they blurred indistinct and variable barriers. So now the question becomes, what kind of guidance do we have? So we know what's called the Lemon Test, and the court uses the Lemon Test when dealing with religious issues in schools. So without further ado, the Lemon Test, notice it's yellow. Number one, to avoid excessive entanglement, a school policy must, number one, have a secular purpose that neither endorses nor disapproves of religion. School must have a secular purpose that neither endorses nor disapproves of religion. So if you are receiving public funds, if you're a publicly funded school, you can't promote a religion, you can't knock a religion. Can't do it. Number two, you must have an effect. So if money is being given to a private school that's Catholic, you must have an effect that neither advances nor prohibits religion. And number 3, you must avoid creating a relationship between religion and government that entangles either the internal affairs of the other. All right, so these are the 3 standards that are used. This is known as the Lemon Test. All right, so now moving forward, 1983. Again, the court's growing a little bit more conservative. This is Marsh v. Chambers. What happens when the chaplain opens a legislative session of the Nebraska legislature with a prayer? We saw it whenever you look at the opening session of Congress in any state legislature. Usually a chaplain will open up with a prayer. The issue here, does the chaplain does the practices of the chaplain of the Nebraska legislature violate the Establishment Clause, the First Amendment? The Supreme Court said no, it did not. And the rationale was that it is a historic tradition that has been approved by early lawmakers who created the First Amendment. All right. This is a fun case. Oregon v. Smith in 1990. A very fun case involving peyote. Okay, so here the fact pattern is this. 2 Native Americans ingested peyote as part of a religious ceremony, and they were fired from their job. They worked at, ironically, a private drug rehab clinic. And most importantly, they were denied unemployment benefits. So again, if you quit your job, you can obtain benefits. But if you're fired for a job for cause, the state may be able to deny you benefits. So the question is, can the state deny unemployment benefits to a worker who was fired for using illegal drugs for religious purposes? And the Supreme Court in 1990, this is the Rehnquist Court, so it's more conservative, they say yes. Religious beliefs do not excuse a person from compliance with an otherwise valid law that the government is enforcing. And the rationale of this case is that allowing exceptions to this law based on religious beliefs would provide exceptions for almost every conceivable kind. All right. And I'll even boil it down something more simple. If you found that you failed that the teacher thought you were under the influence and suspended you, you argue that it's a religious test or some sort of religious ceremony, you would have people saying that it opens the door. It's the slippery slope argument. All right, continuing with religious freedom, again, the Rehnquist Court. This is Santa Fe v. Doe. Why is it Doe? Because it's a minor, and typically with minors, or when the court is trying to protect the identity of someone, they will address the name as Doe. So here's a student-led, student-initiated prayer that recited over the loudspeaker at a football game at a public high school on a weekly basis. So this is, if we're going out to, let's say, if the flock was, giving a prayer at halftime or before the game. The issue, does the Santa Fe School District's policy allowing prayer at a football game violate the Establishment Clause? The Supreme Court said yes, it did, because people are sitting there. They are forced to do it, and the school district did not separate itself from the invocations of religious content, resulting in both perceived and actual endorsement of religion. So most times what you'll have in school settings is you will have a moment of silence. So that way, if you are atheist, you can stand there. If you are of a Buddha, regardless of your faith, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, you can have if you want to pray silently, you can pray. If you just want to observe a moment of silence, you can do that as well. By doing that, having a moment of silence, you're not promoting or endorsing religion. All right, you've got McCreary County v. ACLA in 2005. So again, this is a later case. It's going to be the Roberts Court. A framed copy of the Ten Commandments is displayed in a county courthouse. The issue, do the Ten Commandments displayed in a courthouse violate the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from passing laws respecting an establishment of religion? Interesting. The decision by the Supreme Court, yes, in fact, it did violate the First Amendment, and the rationale was that you were advancing religion as interpreted by an observer. So unmistakable purpose of emphasizing and celebrating the Ten Commandments is a religious message. Now, interesting enough, and I think we addressed this in this next case, here we go. A monument inscribed by the Ten Commandments is located on government property. This is in 2005. Does the monument of the Ten Commandment on government property violate the Establishment Clause, which barred the government from passing laws respecting an establishment of religion? Supreme Court says no. So what's the difference between the Ten Commandments in a courtroom versus on the property? Well, the rationale of the court is this. Passive display that acknowledges the historical significance of religion as a foundation for our country and government. So the Supreme Court said, and this is a quote from the brief, is that simply having religious content or promoting a message consistent with a religious doctrine does not run afoul of the Establishment Clause. So it is safe to say you can have a religious object outside a public building, but not necessarily inside of it. For example, you are walking past the building that has the Ten Commandments on the outside of it. That is an option. You can choose another path. Whereas if you were arrested or ticketed, you don't have much of an option. You are mandated to appear in that courtroom. Another example, very interestingly enough, is that in the House of Representatives, and I'll have to find photos, and one of you guys can ask me in class, in the House of Representatives, up at the top of the wall, there are busts of all the famous lawmakers throughout history. And they are all in profile form, except one. And it is the one medallion that faces the speaker's chair, and that is of Moses. So it's very interesting to see that there is a blend of religion and politics wherever we go. All right, the right to bear arms. I'm going to save that for a second video, so not to ruin the surprise. So you can stop this movie now and move on to video 4 on the right to bear arms.